April 12, 1945. The air in the White House was unusually heavy, thick with anticipation and dread. Outside, the cherry blossoms had begun their timid bloom along Pennsylvania Avenue, their soft pink petals stirring in a pale spring breeze. Inside, however, the corridors were tense, echoing with the measured footsteps of aides who knew something monumental had just occurred. In the Oval Office, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt lay motionless, a silent sentinel to the countless decisions that had shaped the world through war and depression. His breathing was shallow, his hand resting lightly on the resolute leather arm of his chair. The ticking of the grandfather clock near the window marked the seconds with merciless precision, each tick a reminder of the fragility of life and leadership. Harry S. Truman, newly sworn in as the 33rd President of the United States, sat stiffly across from the desk. His brow was furrowed, his hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white against the fabric of his dark suit. He had entered the presidency with the nation at war, the Allies on the verge of victory, and the atomic bomb project still shrouded in secrecy. The weight of it all pressed down like the humid summer air of Missouri, dense and inescapable. Truman's eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on the portraits of former presidents, men who had shaped the country in times of crisis, their painted eyes seeming to watch, silently judging the man who now carried the burdens of the free world. And then, almost imperceptibly, his gaze shifted to the telephone, the polished brass glinting under the afternoon sunlight filtering through the tall windows. It was a lifeline to the sprawling machinery of government, but one that reminded him that the men and women currently occupying the rooms of power were all remnants of Roosevelt's administration. He inhaled slowly, a deliberate act to steady the whirlwind of thought inside his mind. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr., a veteran of 11 years, known for his calm logic and deep moral compass, had been guiding the nation's finances through depression and war. Interior Secretary Harold Ickes, 13 years in his post, had transformed public works and fought tirelessly for civil rights, a stalwart presence of integrity amid political turbulence. Commerce Secretary Henry Wallace, idealistic and internationally minded, had envisioned a world of cooperation, a dream Truman found increasingly out of step with the emerging realities of global power. And James Byrnes, Secretary of State, pragmatic and strategic, had already begun steering early Cold War policy with a meticulous eye. But Truman could feel it, a growing, insistent notion that loyalty to the nation, however noble, could not substitute for trust in the man now sitting in the Oval Office. He realized that the stakes were far higher than preserving continuity for continuity's sake. The atomic age loomed, Europe lay in ruins, and the Soviet Union was already flexing its muscles in Eastern Europe. Every decision, every whisper, every signature carried consequences that could reverberate across continents. And he would need his own team to navigate these uncharted waters. Outside the Oval Office, the clatter of typewriters and the muted footsteps of aides creating a symphony of bureaucratic tension. Truman rose, straightened his tie, and adjusted his cufflinks, small acts of control in a world suddenly slipping toward chaos. The decision forming in his mind was unspoken, yet resolute. Within months, the cabinet that had served Roosevelt for over a decade would be replaced. Not because of incompetence, not because of personal failing, but because the presidency itself demanded alignment, loyalty, and the assurance that each hand guiding the nation was firmly his own. In the coming weeks, letters would be dispatched, conversations held behind closed doors, and the gears of political transition would begin to churn. The nation, weary from war yet eager for peace, would never fully grasp the magnitude of the transformation occurring in these quiet halls. But Harry Truman, standing in the lingering spring light of the Oval Office, understood. The mantle of leadership was his alone, and the men who had shaped the wartime government must now make way for a new vision, one that would define the United States' post-war trajectory and shape the very foundation of the Cold War era. The cabinet room was silent, yet tense, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Sunlight slanted through the tall windows, catching dust motes that floated lazily in the air. Truman entered with measured steps, the leather soles of his shoes barely whispering against the polished floor. Around the long mahogany table sat the men who had shepherded the nation through depression and global war: Morgenthau, Ickes, Wallace, Byrnes, and the others. Their expressions were polite but wary, each one aware that the new president was sizing them up, weighing not just their past service but their fit for a world that had already begun to shift under Truman's feet. Truman's eyes scanned the room, lingering on Morgenthau. The Treasury Secretary had been Roosevelt's financial anchor for over a decade, a man of quiet resolve who had guided wartime expenditures with painstaking precision. Yet Truman sensed a fundamental difference in philosophy. Morgenthau's moral compass leaned toward measured humanitarianism. He had been instrumental in establishing the War Refugee Board, saving thousands of lives from Nazi persecution. Truman respected this, but he also knew that the emerging post-war order demanded a more aggressive stance on global finance, one that could decisively contain Soviet influence and secure American interests. Harold Ickes, seated a few chairs down, tapped a pen against the polished surface of the table, eyes narrowed slightly. Ickes had spent 13 years managing massive public works programs, championing civil rights, and ensuring that federal funds were not siphoned off by corruption. His reputation as a meticulous administrator was unmatched. But Truman, mindful of the coming struggle to implement his vision of a strong, interventionist foreign policy, recognized that Ickes' rigid independence could clash with the cohesive team he envisioned. Henry Wallace, the ever-optimistic Secretary of Commerce, leaned back in his chair, clasping his hands behind his head. Wallace's vision of post-war cooperation, of international trade fostering global harmony, had been Roosevelt's dream as well. But Truman was already sensing that idealism alone would not secure the fragile balance of power. The Soviets were already moving in Eastern Europe, and the world's future would not be won through goodwill but through strategic decisiveness, and that required a cabinet aligned with Truman's pragmatic approach. James Byrnes, Secretary of State, radiated the quiet confidence of a man already adjusting to the new realities. He had been Roosevelt's trusted emissary, navigating the treacherous corridors of diplomacy with the precision of a chess master. Yet even Byrnes' skill would have to bend to the priorities of Truman's administration: firm containment of Soviet expansion, creation of a post-war economic structure that favored American interests, and the eventual formation of alliances that would define the Cold War. Truman cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the stillness like a gavel. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "I've taken the oath of office with the understanding that the world we face is different from the one President Roosevelt navigated. My responsibility is to the nation, and that means assembling a team I can rely on, not just in experience, but in shared vision." There was a pause, long enough for the weight of the statement to settle into the room. Morgenthau's lips pressed into a thin line, Ickes' hand tightened around his pen, Wallace's hopeful gaze faltered ever so slightly. Byrnes' eyes, though calm, betrayed a flicker of calculation. Each man understood that Truman was signaling a fundamental truth: their service, no matter how distinguished, was secondary to the president's prerogative to shape the executive branch as he saw fit. Over the following weeks, letters would be drafted, conversations would ripple through the corridors of power, and resignations would quietly arrive. Truman's method was deliberate, almost surgical. He did not seek public drama or scandal. He sought alignment, loyalty, and a team that could execute the foreign and domestic strategy he believed essential to America's survival and growth. The process was neither vindictive nor impulsive. It was political realism, rooted in an acute understanding that the post-war order demanded clarity of purpose. Meanwhile, Washington buzzed with speculation. Journalists whispered about the president's intentions. Politicians weighed the implications for the 1948 election. The public remained largely unaware that a slow, methodical purge of Roosevelt's cabinet had begun. In the Oval Office, Truman charted the path forward. One by one, the seasoned veterans of FDR's administration would be replaced, their legacies respected but no longer central to the machinery of government. The stage was being set for the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and ultimately the formation of NATO, policies that would define the next era of American foreign relations. The summer of 1945 arrived with a heat that seemed almost suffocating in Washington, D.C., the city simmering not just under the sun but under the weight of historic change. Across the nation, celebrations marked the end of the war in Europe. VE Day had come and gone with parades, church bells, and tears of relief. Yet inside the corridors of power, the mood was far more somber, focused, and tense. Victory in Europe did not mean the work was over. A new conflict of strategy, ideology, and political control had already begun. Truman's attention was consumed with the endgame in the Pacific. The Manhattan Project, secretive and immense, had brought the nation to the precipice of a new era. Advisors whispered about Japan, about how to compel surrender without catastrophic casualties. And amid all of this, the question of personnel loomed large. The men who had served Roosevelt, stalwarts of experience, decorated with years of loyal service, were increasingly at odds with the rapid pace and strategic demands Truman faced. Morgenthau, in particular, had begun to clash with the president. The Treasury Secretary remained deeply committed to Roosevelt's vision of post-war economic restraint, including his infamous Morgenthau Plan, which aimed to deindustrialize Germany to prevent future militarism. Truman, now holding the reins of global diplomacy and power, recognized the plan's potential to destabilize Europe further. Private meetings grew heated. Discussions of German recovery and American economic priorities highlighted the philosophical gulf between the two men. Meanwhile, Ickes found himself under subtle but persistent scrutiny. The Interior Secretary's dedication to civil rights and public works was unquestioned, yet his resistance to Truman's approach to international development and his occasional public critiques of administration policies made him a liability in the president's mind. Truman did not dislike Ickes personally. He simply could not afford an independent streak when the country's global influence was on the line. Wallace remained the most visible challenge to Truman's authority. His idealistic speeches advocating global cooperation and a conciliatory approach to the Soviet Union, though grounded in principle, ran counter to Truman's emerging stance of containment. Wallace's vision of internationalism, once celebrated under Roosevelt, now appeared naive in the president's eyes, a luxury the United States could no longer afford as it stepped into the vacuum left by a weakened Europe and the aggressive moves of Moscow. Byrnes, on the other hand, was already being subtly co-opted into Truman's inner circle, his pragmatism aligning more closely with the president's strategic objectives. Though he had served Roosevelt with distinction, he possessed the political dexterity to adapt to the new administration's priorities. Byrnes became a bridge between the old guard and Truman's vision, a necessary ally in both personnel management and early Cold War diplomacy. In private moments, Truman wrestled with the human weight of his decisions. Replacing a cabinet was not a mere administrative task, it was an act of political courage, and, inevitably, political risk. Each letter requesting a resignation carried more than ink, it carried the acknowledgement of an era ending, of loyal men stepping aside so the nation could navigate the challenges of an atomic age and a shifting geopolitical landscape. By late summer, the first departures were quietly formalized. Morgenthau would tender his resignation from the Treasury, citing health and a desire to return to private life. Ickes, under increasing pressure, announced his decision to step down, framing it as a culmination of long service and an opportunity for younger leadership to take the reins. Wallace's removal from commerce was more public, sparking whispers in the press about the Truman Purge of Roosevelt loyalists, a term Truman himself found distasteful but one that would linger in political discourse. Behind the scenes, Truman meticulously selected replacements. Dean Acheson, George Marshall, and other rising figures were brought into the fold, men whose loyalty and vision aligned with Truman's emerging foreign policy framework. These appointments would form the backbone of the administration's response to the post-war crises, including the recovery of Europe, the Marshall Plan, and the nascent strategies that would define the Cold War. In the Oval Office, late into the night, Truman reviewed dossiers, memoranda, and correspondence. He paused over each name, weighing the expertise, loyalty, and temperament of potential successors. The decisions were not merely bureaucratic, they were historic. Each appointment would influence not only the immediate recovery and restructuring of a war-torn world, but also the political calculus leading into the 1948 presidential election. Truman understood that replacing Roosevelt's cabinet was more than a matter of preference, it was a strategic necessity. He was not merely inheriting a presidency, he was redefining it. And with each departure and each carefully chosen successor, the United States was quietly transforming from a wartime government into a post-war administration poised to confront the challenges of a new global order. October in Washington carried a crisp edge, a reminder that change was not only in the air but inescapable. Leaves rustled across Lafayette Square as aides and couriers moved swiftly through the brisk streets, clutching bundles of memos and appointment letters. Inside the White House, President Truman walked the corridors with a determined stride, each step echoing like a heartbeat that measured the pace of a nation on the cusp of transformation. The cabinet room, once a theater of continuity, had become a place of careful orchestration. Truman now sat at the head of the table, a stack of dossiers before him. Each one represented a decision that would ripple far beyond these walls. Replacing long-serving Roosevelt advisors was delicate work, politically, administratively, and morally. Truman knew that removing veteran figures like Morgenthau, Ickes, and Wallace risked public perception, but he also knew that retaining them could paralyze his presidency at a moment when clarity and cohesion were essential. Dean Acheson had been quietly summoned, an intellectual force with a sharp understanding of international relations. His mind worked like a chessboard, anticipating moves before they were necessary. Truman found in Acheson a blend of pragmatism and vision that could execute the administration's emerging doctrine of containment. Similarly, George Marshall, recently returned from commanding Allied forces in Europe, was seen as indispensable. Marshall's respect among military and civilian leaders alike offered both credibility and authority, bridging the gap between the old Roosevelt-era hierarchy and Truman's post-war ambitions. Meanwhile, Truman watched with cautious relief as Byrnes adapted seamlessly, accepting the subtle shift from Roosevelt's confidant to Truman's strategic partner. Byrnes' experience with diplomacy, combined with a willingness to embrace the president's vision, made him a stabilizing force in an otherwise turbulent transition. But the changes were not purely about foreign policy. Domestically, Truman moved to ensure his team could implement reforms and respond to the shifting demands of the American people. Wallace's replacement with more moderate and politically aligned figures reflected a conscious decision. Truman needed cabinet members whose loyalty was to his administration's priorities, not to the dreams or ideals of a predecessor. This balancing act, replacing experience without losing expertise, was central to the transformation. Behind closed doors, conversations grew tense yet purposeful. Morgenthau, Ickes, and Wallace were invited to resign with dignity, their legacies honored but inevitably retired. Truman's manner was respectful, but firm. He needed men who could act decisively in a world where hesitation could cost lives, economies, and influence. Each resignation was a calculated step toward consolidating leadership, ensuring that authority was not diluted by competing loyalties or philosophies. The personnel shift was not immediate. Weeks turned into months as Truman carefully assessed potential candidates, consulted with advisors, and weighed political consequences. Every appointment had to serve dual purposes: advancing national strategy and strengthening the president's political position. By the end of the year, most of Roosevelt's cabinet had been replaced, marking one of the most significant personnel overhauls in modern American history. The consequences of this transformation were already becoming evident. The administration moved swiftly to articulate policies that would shape the post-war world. Truman began outlining the Truman Doctrine, laying the groundwork for U.S. support against communist expansion. Conversations about European reconstruction evolved into what would become the Marshall Plan, while strategic consultations hinted at the eventual formation of NATO. Every decision was influenced, directly or indirectly, by the careful curation of a cabinet fully aligned with Truman's vision. In private moments, Truman allowed himself a rare reflection. The magnitude of what he had undertaken weighed heavily. He had not merely replaced personnel, he had reshaped the very machinery of American governance. The legacy of Roosevelt's administration was respected, but Truman's imprint would be unmistakable, guiding the nation through the precarious transition from global war to geopolitical tension and laying the foundation for the American century. The first snow of 1946 blanketed Washington, D.C., muffling the sounds of a city in quiet contemplation. Smoke curled from chimneys along the avenues, carrying the scent of burning coal and wood. Inside the White House, warmth radiated from the polished floors and the glowing fireplaces, yet the atmosphere was anything but cozy. Truman moved with precise purpose through the corridors, each step measured, each conversation deliberate. The transition from Roosevelt's cabinet was nearly complete, and the president's vision for a new administration had begun to take tangible form. By now, Morgenthau had officially departed from the Treasury, leaving behind a legacy of prudence, wartime financial stewardship, and the establishment of the War Refugee Board, a silent testament to the humanitarian side of governance. His departure, though amicable in formal terms, sent ripples through Washington. Politicians and bankers alike understood the significance. The man who had guided U.S. finances through depression and war was stepping aside for a new era of strategic financial policymaking. Ickes' resignation followed a similar trajectory. Known for his incorruptibility and unwavering dedication to public works and civil rights, Ickes had been a moral anchor in Roosevelt's administration. Yet his independent streak, his insistence on personal oversight of policies, and occasional friction with Truman's priorities made his departure inevitable. His final meetings in the Oval Office were quiet but tense, a mixture of respect and recognition that the era of New Deal stewardship had come to an end. Henry Wallace's exit was perhaps the most politically charged. A visionary in commerce and international cooperation, Wallace had been Roosevelt's choice for a future oriented toward global peace and collaboration. But Truman, increasingly aware of the emerging Soviet threat, saw Wallace's idealism as a vulnerability. When Wallace left, whispers of betrayal and the purge circulated in the press, but Truman's decision reflected a cold calculation. Loyalty to the presidency and alignment with strategic objectives outweighed personal ideals. With these departures, Truman's handpicked successors began to fill the void. John Snyder took over as Treasury Secretary, bringing a pragmatic approach to post-war finance. Harold Stassen, soon to rise as a key policy advisor, contributed to the administration's forward-looking domestic strategy. The cabinet was no longer merely a collection of experienced officials, it was a unified team, fully attuned to Truman's priorities: rebuilding Europe, confronting Soviet ambitions, and consolidating domestic stability. The transformation of the cabinet also sent a clear message to Congress and the public: Truman was no longer the vice president who had stepped into the Oval Office by accident. He was a decisive leader, capable of making politically difficult decisions to shape the nation's future. Behind the scenes, aides worked tirelessly to coordinate transitions, draft memos, and ensure continuity in critical operations. The machinery of government continued to function, even as its operators changed. Strategically, the implications were immediate. The replacement of Roosevelt-era officials allowed Truman to assert his influence over foreign policy decisively. Byrnes, now fully aligned, helped negotiate the early contours of the US-Soviet relationship. The groundwork for the Truman Doctrine was being laid, emphasizing containment and the strategic use of American power to resist communist expansion. Simultaneously, the planning for the Marshall Plan moved forward, with Truman's cabinet ensuring that economic assistance could be distributed in a manner consistent with both humanitarian goals and strategic interests. Yet the transition was not merely a matter of global strategy, it was deeply political. The looming 1948 presidential election made the loyalty and alignment of cabinet members even more critical. Truman understood that experienced advisors with independent ambitions could complicate messaging, weaken legislative agendas, and disrupt the coherence of his administration's vision. By carefully shaping his team, he strengthened not only governance but also his political position, ensuring that when the nation went to the polls, the administration's record and policy direction would reflect his leadership, not Roosevelt's legacy. The snow outside the White House thickened, blanketing the streets in white silence. Inside, Truman sat alone in the Oval Office late at night, reviewing memos, reports, and letters. Each signature, each appointment, each carefully orchestrated departure had brought the United States closer to a unified vision of post-war leadership. The nation, exhausted from war yet poised for influence, was now guided by a cabinet that reflected the president's judgment, priorities, and unyielding determination. Spring arrived in Washington, D.C., carrying a sense of renewal that belied the tensions simmering beneath the surface of the global order. The cherry blossoms bloomed again, their delicate petals drifting in the breeze like quiet reminders of impermanence. Yet in the White House, the air was heavy with decisions that would define decades. Truman's cabinet, now fully his own, operated as a well-oiled engine, each member chosen for loyalty, vision, and the ability to navigate the treacherous waters of post-war politics. The nation watched quietly as the administration took shape. The Truman Doctrine had been articulated, signaling a decisive shift in foreign policy. The United States would actively support nations resisting communist encroachment. Marshall's economic genius, combined with the strategic acumen of Byrnes and the disciplined coordination of Ickes, set the stage for the European Recovery Program, the Marshall Plan, which would funnel billions of dollars into rebuilding a continent devastated by war. Truman's cabinet was no longer a collection of inherited advisors, it was a cohesive team capable of translating his vision into global influence. Behind the scenes, the lessons of replacing Roosevelt's cabinet had become clear. Institutional knowledge was invaluable, but loyalty, adaptability, and strategic alignment mattered even more. Truman's careful curation ensured that each department spoke with one voice, minimizing bureaucratic friction and enabling rapid responses to emerging crises. From the Department of State to Treasury, Commerce to Defense, every branch operated under a unified doctrine. The United States would lead, not merely react, in shaping the post-war world. Domestically, the effects were equally profound. Truman's team pushed for policies that balanced the needs of a peacetime economy with the lingering demands of wartime reconstruction. Veterans returned home to a nation eager to reintegrate them into civilian life, while Congress negotiated the complexities of labor unrest, inflation, and housing shortages. Each cabinet decision reflected Truman's understanding that domestic stability and international strength were inseparable, one could not be sacrificed for the other. As 1947 progressed, the structure of the post-war order began to crystallize. NATO was conceptualized in the discussions of Truman's inner circle, an alliance designed to counterbalance Soviet influence in Europe. The early Cold War was no longer a distant concept, it was an urgent reality requiring decisive leadership. Truman's cabinet, carefully molded from the remnants of Roosevelt's advisors and his handpicked successors, became the engine driving this transformation. Looking back, the systematic replacement of Roosevelt's cabinet within 18 months of Truman taking office was more than a political maneuver, it was a statement of presidential authority. Truman understood that the mantle of leadership carried not only responsibility but the necessity of alignment. Expertise mattered, but without cohesion and loyalty, the machinery of government could falter at the very moment the world demanded precision. In quiet moments, Truman reflected on the men who had served before him, Morgenthau, Ickes, Wallace, and others. Their legacies were respected, their contributions monumental. Yet the path forward required a new team, one that could act decisively, embody his vision, and carry the nation into an uncertain future. By the spring of 1947, that team was firmly in place, and the United States stood poised to enter a new era, a world defined by Cold War strategy, post-war recovery, and the unmistakable imprint of a president who reshaped his government to meet history head-on.